Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to live inside a horror movie? To face a creature so terrifying that the mere mention of its name sends shivers down your spine? Well, this is my story. Imagine being thrust into a nightmare where everything you thought you knew about the world begins to unravel. The night was dark, the air thick with an eerie silence. I remember standing on the deck of the most magnificent ship ever built, the Titanic. A marvel of human engineering, they called it. Unsinkable, they said. But what if I told you that everything you've heard about that night is a lie? That it wasn't an iceberg that brought this mighty vessel to its knees, but something far more sinister? What if I told you that God himself played a hand in our doom? That he commanded the very forces of nature, the sea creatures we've only whispered about in nightmares, to drag us down to the icy depths? I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't lived it. But I was there, and I saw things no one else has seen. I faced creatures beyond my wildest nightmares, creatures that shouldn't exist in our world. But they do, and on that fateful night, they made sure the Titanic would never reach its destination. This is the story of how we were lied to, of how the Titanic met its end, not by the hands of nature, but by the will of something far greater. And what if I was the main actor in this horrifying tale? This is the true story of the Titanic, not the one they told you, not the one in the history books. This is the story of what really happened that fateful night, when God himself commanded the sea to rise up against us. And I was there, I lived it, and now I'm here to tell you the truth. April 10th, 1912. The Titanic was set to sail, and I found myself among the fortunate few to board the grandest ship ever built. They called it unsinkable, a masterpiece of engineering, and I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. My name isn't important right now, but you'll come to know me as Jack. Yes, just like in the stories. But my tale isn't one of romance, it's one of terror. Yes, I know I died many years ago, but I have just recently reincarnated, and I still carry with me the memories of what happened that very night. The day I stepped aboard, the ship gleamed under the sunlight, her hull rising like a metal mountain from the sea. I remember seeing Chief Engineer Thomas Andrews standing proudly on the deck, greeting passengers with a smile. His words echoed in my mind. Not even God could sink this ship. Those words would haunt me later, but at that moment, they were just part of the excitement. The ship felt invincible, a floating palace that would carry us across the Atlantic to a new life. Little did we know that the ocean had other plans. The sun was shining and the air was filled with excitement as hundreds of passengers made their way onto the ship. The docks were crowded with people, all eager to catch a glimpse of the great ship that everyone was talking about. I remember standing there, suitcase in hand, looking up at the massive hull of the Titanic and feeling a sense of awe. But it wasn't just the size that took my breath away. It was the promise of adventure, the chance to escape my old life and start anew. I was a young man with nothing but dreams, and this ship was my ticket to a brighter future. As I stepped onto the gangway, I felt the wooden planks beneath my feet vibrate with the life of the ship. People around me were laughing, waving to loved ones on shore, completely oblivious to the dark fate that awaited us. The air was thick with excitement, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of something monumental, something history would remember forever. I had no idea how right I was. Inside, the ship was even more magnificent than I had imagined. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the polished wooden walls gleamed in the warm light. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of luxury, plush carpets, ornate furniture, and finely dressed passengers milling about. It felt like I had stepped into another world, far removed from the dirt and grime of the streets I had left behind. I wandered through the ship, taking in the grandeur. My steerage ticket didn't grant me access to the upper decks, but I didn't mind. I was just grateful to be on board. The lower levels were lively, filled with people from all walks of life, immigrants like me dreaming of the opportunities that awaited us in America. There was music, laughter, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchens. It felt like nothing could go wrong, But as I made my way through the corridors, a strange feeling began to settle in my gut. It was subtle at first, like a cold breeze brushing against the back of my neck, but it grew stronger with each step I took. Something about the ship felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was as if the Titanic was more than just steel and rivets, more than just an engineering marvel. It felt alive, as if the ship itself was watching us, waiting. That night, as the ship pulled away from the dock, I stood on the deck, watching the coastline disappear into the distance. The ocean stretched out before us, vast and endless, a dark abyss that seemed to swallow the last rays of sunlight. The wind whipped through my hair, carrying with it a faint whisper, too soft to make out but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the excitement, the anticipation of the journey ahead. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The days passed in a blur of activity. During the day, the Titanic buzzed with life. People dined in extravagant halls, mingled on the decks, and danced to the tunes of live orchestras. But at night, when the moonlight shimmered off the surface of the ocean, the ship felt different. The grandeur seemed almost hollow, like a stage set for a tragedy no one could see coming. I started noticing small things first. Late at night, when the corridors were silent and the only sound was the creaking of the ship, I would hear voices, whispered conversations, faint and distant, but there. At first, I thought it was just the crew or other passengers, but every time I tried to follow the sound, it would vanish, leaving nothing but the eerie stillness of the ship. One night, I was wandering the lower decks, restless and unable to sleep. The third-class area was a maze of narrow hallways and cramped rooms, but I liked it there. It felt more real than the opulence above. As I walked, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and that's when I saw her. A woman standing at the end of the corridor dressed in white. Her hair was long and dark, and she stood perfectly still, staring at me. I blinked, and she was gone, just like that. I hurried down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I reached the spot where she had been standing, there was nothing, just an empty passageway leading to the engine room. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and seeing things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I couldn't shake the image of the woman from my mind. I asked a few of the other passengers if they had seen anything strange, but they just laughed it off, saying I must have had one too many drinks the night before. I tried to forget about it, to push the unease to the back of my mind, but as the days went on, the feeling of dread grew stronger. On the fourth night, I found myself in the boiler room, watching the crew shovel coal into the roaring furnaces. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke and steam, but there was something about the place that drew me in. The crew worked in near silence, their faces grim and focused. One of the men glanced up at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "You hear it, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the clanging of metal and the hiss of steam. "Hear what?" I replied, my throat dry. "The voices. They're coming from the ship. She's alive, you know. This isn't just any ship. The ocean doesn't like her, it's angry." I didn't know what to say. The man's words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't dismiss them. The strange noises, the voices, the woman I had seen, it all started to make sense. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. There was something more, something darker at play. That night, as I lay in my bunk, the ship shuddered violently. At first, I thought it was just turbulence, but then the sound came, a deep, rumbling groan that seemed to vibrate through the very core of the Titanic. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the deck, along with dozens of other passengers who had been startled by the noise. The sea was eerily calm, the sky clear, but the ship felt wrong. I looked over the edge of the railing and saw it. The water was swirling, churning as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. Panic gripped me as I realized that we were not alone. Something was down there, something ancient and powerful. Just then I heard a faint sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it was music, a haunting melodic tune that seemed to rise up from the depths of the ocean. I turned to the other passengers, but no one else seemed to hear it. They were too busy panicking, shouting at the crew, demanding answers. I tried to warn them, tried to tell them that something was coming, but no one would listen. And then, as if in answer to my fears, the ship lurched violently, throwing people to the ground. The Titanic was sinking, but it wasn't an iceberg that had caused the damage. No, this was something far worse. The ship lurched again, more violently this time, and screams echoed through the night air. I clung to the railing, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched the water swirl and churn below. Something was moving beneath the surface, something massive. The cold grip of fear tightened around me as the music grew louder, more haunting, as if the ocean itself was singing a song of doom. I tried to steady myself, but the ship felt like it was being pulled by an unseen force. I ran toward the bow, pushing through the crowd of panicked passengers. My mind raced with a single thought. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't an iceberg. Something else was down there, something alive. Reaching the front of the ship, I caught a glimpse of the water below, and my blood ran cold. The dark shape of a colossal creature writhed beneath the surface, its massive tentacles stretching out like the fingers of death. A kraken. I had only heard tales of such beasts, whispered stories of monsters that lived in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. But now, here it was, rising from the depths to claim the Titanic. As the ship groaned and tilted, I stumbled back, barely able to keep my balance. The night sky above was clear, the stars shining brightly as if mocking the chaos below. Around me, passengers screamed in terror, their faces pale with fear as they realized what was happening. But even as they panicked, I knew that the Kraken wasn't acting alone. The words of Chief Engineer Thomas Andrews echoed in my mind. Not even God could sink this ship. Had we angered something greater than the ocean? Was this our punishment for our hubris, for daring to challenge the sea with our arrogance? Suddenly, a strange chill swept over me, colder than the night air. I turned and saw her again, the woman in white, standing at the edge of the deck, staring out at the water. Her face was pale, her dark hair flowing in the wind like the sea itself. This time I didn't look away. I walked toward her, drawn by some invisible force, as if she held the answers to the questions racing through my mind. When I reached her, she spoke without turning to face me. "He is coming for you, Jack." My breath caught in my throat. "Who? Who's coming?" "The one who commands the sea," she whispered, her voice soft and distant like the wind. "The one who heard the words of man and took offense. You cannot escape him." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "You mean God?" She shook her head slowly. "No, not God, but a power far older. The ocean itself obeys his will." I stared at her, struggling to make sense of what she was saying. The ship groaned again, tilting further, and I could hear the sound of water rushing into the lower decks. The Titanic was sinking, and there was no stopping it. "But why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why is this happening?" She finally turned to face me, her eyes dark and cold like the depths of the sea. "Because you challenged him, your kind. You believed you could conquer the ocean, that you could build something greater than nature itself. And now, the sea has come to claim what is hers." The weight of her words hit me like a blow to the chest. It wasn't just Thomas Andrews' arrogance that had brought this upon us. It was all of us. We had built the Titanic as a symbol of human achievement, a monument to our own pride, and now we were paying the price. The woman stepped closer, her gaze never leaving mine. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion, Jack. The Kraken will drag this ship into the abyss, and there is nothing you can do." I wanted to argue, to shout that it wasn't fair, that we didn't deserve this. But deep down, I knew she was right. The ocean had spoken, and we were powerless to fight against it. A loud crack echoed through the night, and I turned to see the bow of the ship dip dangerously into the water. The passengers around me screamed, scrambling to the lifeboats, but I knew there weren't enough. Panic was spreading like wildfire, and the crew was doing their best to maintain order, but it was no use. The Titanic was doomed. As I stood there watching the chaos unfold, the woman in white faded into the shadows, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't just stand there and let it happen. I had to do something, even if it meant facing the beast below. I rushed toward the lifeboats, helping others climb aboard. Women and children first. That's what the crew kept shouting, but it didn't matter. The Kraken didn't care who was on board. It was coming for all of us. As I helped one of the crew lower a lifeboat into the water, I felt the ship shudder again. I looked over the edge and saw one of the creature's tentacles rise from the water, its dark, slimy skin glistening in the moonlight. It was massive, far larger than I had imagined, and it moved with a terrifying grace. The tentacle wrapped around the bow of the ship, pulling it further into the water. The Titanic groaned in protest, but it was no use. The beast was too strong. I ran to the other side of the deck, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see the terror on the faces of the passengers, could hear their desperate cries for help, but there was nothing I could do. The Kraken was unstoppable. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the music again, that haunting melody rising from the depths, growing louder and more insistent. I looked around, trying to find the source, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Suddenly, the woman in white appeared beside me again, her face calm amidst the chaos. "The song of the sea," she whispered. "It calls to him." I didn't understand what she meant, but I could feel the pull of the music, like a siren song beckoning me closer to the edge of the ship. The Kraken's tentacles continued to wrap around the Titanic, squeezing tighter, dragging it down into the abyss. And then, in a flash of understanding, I realized what I had to do. I ran toward the railing, ignoring the shouts of the crew and passengers. The woman in white followed me, her gaze unwavering. The music grew louder, drowning out the screams, the groans of the ship, and the roaring of the ocean. It was as if the entire world had been reduced to that single haunting melody. I climbed onto the railing, looking down at the churning water below. The Kraken's massive body writhed beneath the surface, its tentacles coiling around the ship like a serpent. "Jack!" someone shouted behind me, but I didn't turn around. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. And then, with one final glance at the woman in white, I jumped. The cold water engulfed me, pulling me down into the depths. I fought to stay afloat, but the current was too strong. The music surrounded me, filling my ears, my mind, my soul. As I sank deeper, the last thing I saw was the massive form of the Kraken, its dark eyes glowing with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. It was waiting for me. And then, everything went black. I opened my eyes to darkness. I was no longer on the Titanic, nor was I floating in the icy waters of the Atlantic. Everything around me was pitch black, an endless void stretching in all directions. It was quiet, eerily quiet, as if the world itself had been swallowed by silence. My body felt weightless, suspended in the nothingness. I couldn't tell if I was falling or floating. The coldness of the water was gone, replaced by an unsettling warmth that clung to my skin like a shroud. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My mouth moved, but the silence persisted. Panic surged within me as I realized I was utterly alone. No one could hear me, no one could help me. I had plunged into the abyss, and now I was lost. Suddenly, the void began to shift. Shapes emerged from the darkness, faint at first but growing clearer with every passing second. I blinked, trying to make sense of the swirling forms. They were massive, shadowy figures, gliding through the void like phantoms. As they moved closer, I could make out their serpentine bodies, long and sinuous like eels or sea serpents. The Kraken. It was not alone. There were more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds. Their enormous eyes glowed faintly, watching me with a strange intelligence. I tried to move, to swim away, but my limbs were sluggish, as if weighed down by invisible chains. The creatures circled me, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators sizing up their prey. A deep, resonant voice filled the void, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was a voice unlike any I had ever heard, ancient and powerful, filled with the weight of ages. It rumbled through my mind, vibrating through my bones. "You are here because you challenged the sea." The voice echoed in the empty darkness, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched the void for the source, but there was nothing, only those glowing eyes watching me. What are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The voice replied, its tone deep and commanding. "We are the ancient ones, the keepers of the deep. The sea is our dominion, and no man may defy us." I struggled to comprehend what was happening. My mind raced, flashing back to the Titanic, to Thomas Andrews' arrogant words, to the Kraken rising from the depths. This was all because of that. We had angered something far older than we could ever imagine. "What do you want with me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You have been chosen, Jack," the voice rumbled. "Chosen to bear witness to the truth that has been hidden from your kind for centuries." I swallowed hard, fear gripping my heart. What truth? The shadows shifted again, and for the first time I saw her, the woman in white standing before me, her face pale and haunting. She floated in the void, her dark hair swirling around her like a halo, her eyes deep pools of darkness. But now she was different. She radiated power, a raw, untamed energy that crackled in the air around her. "The truth of the sea," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with an undeniable authority. "The sea is not just water, not just waves. It is a living, breathing force, an ancient power that predates your world, and it will not be defied." I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. My mind struggled to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. The sea, alive, a force beyond our comprehension? "But the Titanic," I stammered. "It was an accident. It hit an iceberg." "No," she interrupted, her eyes locking onto mine. "That is the lie they told you. The sea claimed the Titanic because your kind believed you could conquer it. Your arrogance, your hubris invited the wrath of the deep." The weight of her words crushed me, and I felt a sinking pit of dread in my stomach. We had been lied to. The Titanic had not been felled by an iceberg. It had been pulled into the abyss by the sea itself. The Kraken, the mermaids, the ancient creatures of the deep, they had taken it as punishment for our arrogance. The woman in white drifted closer, her gaze piercing through me. "And now, Jack, you must decide. Will you serve the sea, or will you be consumed by it?" I stared at her, my mind reeling. Serve the sea? What did that even mean? I was just a man, a passenger on a doomed ship. How could I serve something as vast and unknowable as the ocean? The deep voice returned, shaking the very air around me. "You are chosen, Jack. The sea demands your loyalty. You will be its messenger, its harbinger. You will carry the truth of the deep to your kind, or you will be lost forever in the abyss." 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. I had no choice, not really. I could feel the weight of the sea pressing down on me, its power overwhelming, its will undeniable. There was no escape, no way out of this dark place. I will serve," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The woman in white smiled, a cold, eerie smile that sent shivers down my spine. "Then your fate is sealed." Before I could react, the darkness surged around me, swallowing me whole. I was pulled into the depths, deeper and deeper, until there was nothing but the crushing pressure of the sea and the faint, distant echo of the Kraken's song. When I finally opened my eyes again, I was back on the Titanic. The cold night air stung my skin, and the screams of the passengers filled the air. The ship was still sinking, tilting dangerously as the water rushed into its lower decks. But something was different. I could feel it inside me, a strange, unfamiliar power coursing through my veins. The sea had claimed me, marked me as its own. I looked around, dazed and confused, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman in white was gone, the Kraken no longer visible beneath the waves, but I could still hear its song, faint and distant, calling to me. The Titanic groaned again, the bow dipping further into the water. Time was running out. I ran across the deck, pushing through the panicked crowd. My mind was a blur of confusion and fear, but one thought was clear. I had to survive. I had to live to tell the world the truth. As I reached the lifeboats, I saw Rose. She was standing at the edge of the deck, looking out over the chaos with wide, terrified eyes. Our gazes met, and in that moment I knew what I had to do. "Rose!" I shouted, rushing toward her. "We have to go! Now! We have to go! There's no time!" Rose looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "But Jack, what about everyone else? What about—" "There's no time," I interrupted. "We have to get away from the ship." We stumbled toward the nearest lifeboat, but the ship was tilting dangerously now. The deck was nearly vertical, and it was hard to keep our balance. The cold wind whipped around us, biting into our skin. As we reached the lifeboat, we saw that it was already half filled with people. Rose and I climbed in quickly, and the crew began to lower it into the water. Just as the lifeboat touched the icy water, a loud crack echoed through the night. The Titanic lurched violently, and we felt a huge wave of cold spray. I turned to see the ship's stern rising high into the air, its lights flickering as if struggling against the darkness. The lifeboat was tossed around by the waves as we floated away from the ship. I looked back at the Titanic one last time. It was a colossal, dark shape against the night sky, its once proud silhouette now sinking into the depths. The Titanic groaned one final time before disappearing beneath the waves. I watched in horror as the water swallowed the ship whole, the once grand vessel now just a memory. Rose was crying, her tears mixing with the rain and sea spray. I tried to comfort her, but I felt a deep sense of dread. Suddenly I felt a sharp chill run through me. The freezing cold of the Atlantic was starting to take its toll. My hands were numb, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. The shock of the cold and the trauma of what had happened left me shivering uncontrollably. "Jack," Rose said through her tears, "what's happening to us?" I tried to respond, but my teeth were chattering so much that I could barely speak. The cold was growing stronger, seeping into my bones. The lifeboat was far from the ship now, and the distant cries of those left behind were fading away. I grew colder, my vision began to blur. The sea was calm now, a deceptive stillness that masked the danger lurking beneath. I started to feel lightheaded, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. Rose held onto me tightly, her face pale with worry. "I'm so cold," I whispered. "I can't feel my legs." The cold was overwhelming, and I knew that I couldn't last much longer. My body was succumbing to the icy waters of the Atlantic, and as I looked out over the dark sea, I felt myself slipping away. The darkness of the ocean began to close in on me. My vision narrowed, and I felt like I was sinking, even though I was still in the lifeboat. It was as if the sea itself was reaching out to pull me down into its depths. "Jack!" Rose's voice was faint, as if coming from a great distance. "Don't leave me!" I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that I was here, but my strength was failing. The cold had numbed my body and I could no longer move. My vision darkened, and I felt myself being pulled into the depths of the ocean. Everything went black. I was no longer in the lifeboat. I was floating in the icy, dark waters of the Atlantic, my body becoming heavier with every passing second. The cold was unbearable, and I felt like I was sinking into the very heart of the ocean. As I sank deeper, the water grew colder, and I felt a strange sense of calm. My mind was fading, but I was still aware of the darkness around me. The cold water wrapped around me like a shroud, and I felt myself being pulled down into the abyss. Suddenly I saw something, a faint glow in the distance. I strained my eyes to see, but the darkness was so thick that it was hard to make out anything. The glow grew brighter, and I began to see shapes moving in the water. I was sinking deeper and deeper, and the shapes became clearer. They were enormous, shadowy figures, like the kraken I had seen before, but different. They were more ethereal, their bodies shimmering with an otherworldly light. As I sank further, I saw a city, an ancient, submerged city. Its ruins sprawled across the ocean floor. The buildings were massive, with tall spires and intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the darkness. The city seemed to be alive, pulsating with a strange energy. I saw creatures moving among the ruins, enormous sea serpents, their scales glistening in the dark water. They moved gracefully, their eyes glowing with a fierce, intelligent light. I realized that these were the beings that had claimed the Titanic. The voice that had spoken to me before echoed through the water, deep and resonant. "Welcome to the depths, Jack. You are now among the ancient ones." I tried to respond, but the water filled my mouth and I could only hear the voice in my mind. The ancient city was mesmerizing, its ruins a testament to a forgotten age. The sea serpents glided around me, their eyes watching me with curiosity. "The Titanic was not the first," the voice continued. "Many ships have been claimed by the sea. Your kind's arrogance has always angered us." I tried to move, but my body was frozen, my limbs heavy with the cold. The ancient ones surrounded me, their forms shifting and changing as if they were part of the sea itself. The city was a place of dark beauty, its ruins bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light. "You have seen what lies beneath," the voice said. "Now you are part of it. You will carry the truth to your kind, or you will remain here, lost in the abyss." I felt a sense of resignation. The cold was numbing my senses, and the ancient city was becoming a distant dream. My consciousness was slipping away, and I knew that I was becoming part of the ocean's eternal darkness. The last thing I saw was the faint outline of the city's spires, shimmering in the darkness. The sea had claimed its prize, and I was now part of its eternal mystery. Everything went black, and I felt myself being pulled into the endless icy darkness. The ocean had swallowed me whole, and I was lost forever in its cold, unending depths.